Sarah, would you like to say a few words to welcome your colleagues? Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you, as Dr. Concepcion said, to this 40th annual PAASE meeting and symposium. This is parallel session 8.3 on socio-cultural, economic, and political sciences. We have 5 speakers this morning. We have Dr. Emil Bolongaita of Carnegie Mellon in Adelaide. We have Dr. Ramon Clarete of the UP School of Economics. We have Dr. Majah-Leah Ravago of the Ateneo University, Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes of Ateneo University as well, and myself.
In the lumen or in the context of the GI tract in the region.
Okay, our first speaker. So on to our, we have, as we said, we have 5 speakers. We'll have 2 speakers first, Dr. Emiliano Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete, and then we'll have a 15-minute question and answer portion, after which we'll continue with our 3 other speakers and have another question and answer portion. After that, you may, if you have any questions, you can either post them orally, or you can also write them on the chat board. Now, or you can email them to 2020apams@gmail.com. Okay, so on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Emiliano Bolongaita, who is a distinguished service professor of public policy and management at Carnegie Mellon University and the head of Carnegie Mellon University, Australia. Prior to his appointment in 2013, Dr. Bolongaita held various senior roles in international development positions in the Asia-Pacific region. He was the unit head of the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, or CAREC, of the Asian Development Bank, and previous to this role, a public management specialist in the bank's South Asia Department. In his academic career, Dr. Bolongaita has taught at the Elliott School for International Studies at George Washington University, the National University of Singapore, and the Asian Institute of Management. He has written various academic papers on corruption and is co-editor and contributor of Challenging Corruption in Asia, Case Studies and a Framework for Action, published by the World Bank in 2004. Dr. Bolongaita received his PhD in Government and International Studies and Master's in International Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame, Indiana, USA. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Without further ado, please welcome warmly Dr. Bolongaita.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that overly generous introduction. I would like to thank as well Professor Concepcion for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am also delighted to be in the company of a very good friend, Dr. Ramon Clarete, and I'm very pleased to see also some of the former colleagues and who are among the audience in this panel. I note that former Secretary Pernia is joining us, and I would like to thank him for introducing and nominating me to PAASE. I would like to discuss in this talk the changes and challenges to public policy in the age of big tech, big data, and AI. This talk draws on ongoing research that I and my colleague Timo Lachlan are working on, which seeks to understand better the problems and opportunities faced by governments in their development and deployment of big data and AI solutions. We aim to contribute in a modest way to the discussion on the effectiveness of government's use of big data and AI solution to address society's problems in a more democratic manner. My talk will be divided roughly into 4 parts. First, I will talk about the rise of big data and AI, and with reference to how this has fostered big tech, which in turn generated more big data and AI solutions. Second, I will talk about government's response to big tech and government's own embrace of big data and AI, though not necessarily of big tech. And I will talk about some of the successful use of big data and AI solutions by governments, and then also talk about some of their failures. Third, I will present a preliminary analysis for these failures, focusing on the concept of social license and the risk of more failures if governments remain ill-equipped as big data and AI tools become more complex and ambitious. And lastly, I will offer some preliminary ideas about how governments can become more effective in building capacity and social license for their analytics and AI-driven programs. So first, about the rise of big data and AI. I think I state the obvious by talking about this topic. The explosion of structured and unstructured data is arguably the equivalent of the Big Bang. And the World Economic Forum estimates that our digital universe produced around 44 zettabytes as we entered 2020. And this is unsurprising, I suppose, given that 60% of the world's population are digitally active and increasingly more so. The structural drivers of big data growth are clear. The ubiquitousness of the smartphone as it becomes cheaper and more capable of computing power, the utility of the cloud, which amplifies computing power, and the analytical tools that make sense of big data, allowing for machine learning and deep learning. With the rise of big data, analytics has become an invaluable part of business intelligence. The research and advisory firm, Gartner, talks about 4 types of analytics capability. This is the so-called analytics continuum of descriptive analytics, diagnostic analytics, predictive analytics, and finally, prescriptive analytics, with each rung becoming more complex and deriving greater value for their users. Now, we are familiar with the technology firms that are skillfully harvesting, generating, and utilizing big data to develop their products and services and optimize their marketing and sales. The so-called GAFAM or GAFAM firms, top the list. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. With their trove of personal information, big tech are able to harvest and scoop up data for pinpoint marketing for greater returns, as well as pinpoint shaping of preferences to further bolster their own products and services to customers. What the sociologist Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. These big tech firms, fueled by big data, are becoming more and more powerful. And their business logic and business models have created problems that increasingly confront policymakers and regulators. Monopolistic powers that are deployed predatorily, severe information asymmetries between them and their customers and stakeholders, and negative externalities such as the misuse and theft of personal data and the rise of disinformation. As some of you, or many of you, are quite well aware, The latter has notably embroiled Facebook, particularly in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which Facebook data were used by the political consulting firm to sow disinformation to shape voters' preferences in elections in the US and elsewhere, notably including the Philippines. Before it was closed, Cambridge Analytica's website touted its support for a presidential candidate in the Philippines, promoting him as a strong, no-nonsense man of action. With its high internet penetration and heavy use of social media, the whistleblower of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Christopher Wiley, said that the Philippines was targeted by the firm because it was an ideal petri dish for the firm's tactics and techniques. The problems created and faced by big tech have compelled them to seek greater social license for their activities. The concept of social license emerged and gained credence in the mining industry, seen as a vital tool for building legitimacy for minerals extraction. I will use the definition by the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, which defines social license as the level of acceptance or approval granted to an organization's operations or projects by local community and stakeholders. Unquote. As such, social license constrains corporations, as one study puts it, to meet the expectations of society and to avoid activities that societies deem unacceptable. Arguably, as part of their efforts to gain social license, big tech firms have called for more regulation of the internet. Recently, the CEOs of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple fronted a US congressional committee seeking to investigate their alleged violations of various laws, a hearing that will likely lead to more efforts at regulation of big tech and other technology firms. And mindful of the need for social license, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have refused to make facial recognition software available to police departments until governments put in place relevant legislation. If big tech and other corporations' need for social license is clear for their data analytics activities, so do governments. No? More so, given that governments have a more complex relationship with their citizens than corporations do with their customers. No? As Henry Mintzberg described it, governments do not just treat citizens as such, no? Who in a democracy elect officials to run governments, but they also treat citizens as clients who avail of services of governments, as customers who buy goods and services from government, and finally, as subjects who have to obey laws and can be punished for the violations of those laws. In their role as agents of the public, governments have responded to complaints from their citizens and businesses to the behavior and practices of big tech, notably in terms of protection of privacy. Among this is the EU's General Data Protection Legislation, which mandate, among others, that personal data should not be processed unless certain conditions are met, namely transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. While there have been critiques of the insufficient resources that EU governments have placed on the regulatory authorities responsible for GDPR enforcement, the EU and its constituent governments have been enforcing the regulation in many ways. In March of last year, notably, the European Commission fined Google 1.9 billion euros for abusive practices in online advertising. In their role of dealing with citizens as clients, customers, and as subjects, governments have followed in the footsteps of technology companies and embraced big data and AI. There's no question that big data and AI present significant utility for governments and the public sector. Particularly for its internal operations and delivery of services. And governments have rapidly moved up the analytics chain, from descriptive to diagnostic analytics, and increasingly to predictive analytics. There is now a growing body of scholarship in the growth and expansion of algorithmic government. With relative success, governments are using descriptive and diagnostic analytics to improve operational efficiency and delivery of government services. In Australia, for example, where I am located, government is using data science in streamlining business operation across many sectors, from tax collection to social welfare services and public health. With analytics, government agencies are able to manage demand more effectively and deploy resources more efficiently. In certain areas, governments, including here in Australia, have sought to gain greater value through predictive and prescriptive analytics, which is where increasingly they are facing the challenge of social license, which is compounding the technical difficulties brought about by the greater complexity of these tools. Predictive tools are now being deployed and used by various governments to address problems in the very sectors where they only previously used descriptive and diagnostic analytics, such as public health, social services, and law enforcement. The application of predictive analytics in these fields have led to problems and controversies. The failures in the use of governments of big data and AI have manifested themselves in a number of areas. For example, in Ireland, they had the cervical cancer screening scandal, which erupted in 2018, involving women who were given false negatives by the government's or the country's health service cervical check system. In Australia, its robo-debt recovery scheme, where the government sought to use machine learning to determine and recover excess welfare payments. The computer program checked the data between the welfare agency that issues the payments against the income they reported to the Australian Tax Office. At least 20% of the notices of debt were incorrect, as there were actually no debts, with errors affecting the most vulnerable Australians who had the greatest difficulty in responding to the errors. To date, more than 370,000 people were affected. And last month, the government announced that they would refund up to $721 million to Australian citizens. UK's Care.Data program, which was supposed to combine health and social care information across the National Health Service for the benefit of patient care. Anonymized data could be used by researchers to develop new treatments and assess performance of NHS services. However, there were concerns about the sharing of sensitive medical information with commercial companies without the explicit consent of patients, whose objections could be overturned. More than 1 million patients opted out. If governments are encountering big data failures in their role of treating citizens as customers and clients, they are facing more so in their treatment of the citizen as subjects, where it applies coercive powers. In the US, for example, which has the highest incarceration rate in the world and the biggest prison and jail population, big data is being used in predictive risk modeling for determining criminal sentencing and parole terms. As a decision support tool, predictive risk modeling methods have come a long way. We are now in the 4th generation tools, most notably the US COMPASS system. COMPASS, which stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. This machine learning program that aims to predict risk and recidivism has found to be biased heavily against Blacks, which may help to explain this phenomenon of Black Lives Matter. One study showed that Black defendants were often predicted to be at a higher risk of recidivism than they actually were. Black defendants who did not recidivate over a 2-year period were nearly twice as likely to be misclassified as higher risk compared to their white counterparts, 45% versus 23%. While white defendants were often predicted to be less risky than they were. White defendants who re-offended within the next 2 years were mistakenly labeled low risk almost twice as often as Black re-offenders, 48% versus 28%. It is important to note the critical context in which governments are mobilizing and failing in their use of big data and AI solutions. There is worldwide falling trust in government by their citizens, while citizens have greater access to information through the internet, even as they demand more responsiveness from and participation in government activities. This cursory review of the failures of government in their use of big data tools as they move up the analytics continuum indicate that the failures stem from a combination of technical, managerial, political, and no less important, social failures. The technical problems in data mining and machine learning are compounded by poor data management and communication failures between the developers of tools and their political overseers, in great part due to the limited interest or ability of these officials to grasp technical issues. This has led to inadequate social license that helped to dismantle instead of repairing and improving analytic solutions when they encountered problems. This was the case for Australia's Robodebt program. This was the case for UK's Care.Data program and many others. A different problem may arise where social license may be sound and relatively effective, but technical performance could undermine the government's efforts to deploy the analytic solution. For example, Australia's COVID-safe app, designed for contact tracing in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, has managed to exceed the government's target of 40% of residents' uptake. And yet, it has, in a recent study, been found to be technically deficient. It turns out that the Bluetooth handshake over which the app depends on
are hindered if iPhone screens are locked. Now, the technical and social challenges to analytic solutions are likely to become greater as tools become more sophisticated. Explaining the tool and making it less opaque become greater the more complex the tool. And this is clearly the case with predictive analytic tools such as COMPASS, as previously described, a tool that looks at over 137 variables. Now, government's vulnerability in its deployment of big data and AI solution rests in great part on the opacity of these tools and the lack of transparency about the technical aspects and the algorithmic formulas and values of the analytical tools themselves, as well as the development process and the planning for the use of these tools. This transparency problem is compounded by information asymmetries, as big data and AI generate more information for government about their citizens without a corresponding increase in the citizens' knowledge of the workings of their government. Current mechanisms of political participation, which rests on representative government, offer limited capacity for citizens for collective action and limited ability of governments to create mechanisms that generate feedback. It is increasingly evident that addressing the problem of transparency cannot be effectively done by traditional government institutions and their conventional processes. Issues are moving too fast for policymakers and regulators to respond before damage is done. The creation of algorithmic tools are also occurring at a rapid pace. And the breadth of participation required for consultation can no longer be contained by dealing with the usual interest groups. Let me now sum up my talk as follows. Big data and AI present significant opportunities as well as serious challenges to governments and for democratic governance. Big data and AI can give governments greater capacity through descriptive, diagnostic, and predictive analytics. But as governments seek to derive greater value from increasingly complex tools up the analytics continuum, it will face increasing technical, managerial, political, and social challenges. Hence, even as governments seek to develop and deploy analytic tools to address problems at scale, they must also scale up the capacity of their own staff in the civil service to understand the nature of algorithmic solutions and the peculiar challenges to their deployment. This is necessary not just for government's capacity to deliver their own big data and AI solutions, but also to better equip governments to deal with corporations and organizations operating in the political and policy arenas that are themselves utilizing big data and AI solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for that very informative talk, Dr. Bolongaita. We now move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Ramon Clarete, who is the chief of party of the Be Safe project sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the benefit of the country's food safety regulatory agencies, headed by the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drugs Administration. Prior to this, Dr. Clarete led the Gas Policy Development Program, or GPDP, supported by the U.S. Department of State, which provided capacity development assistance and policy advice to Department of Energy and related regulators of natural gas in the country. He teaches and does research in international trade at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, where he served as dean from 2013 to 2015. He obtained his PhD economics degree from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Dr. Clarete took up several short-term economic research and policy assignments under the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, USAID, Asia Foundation for DFAT, and the NEDA. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Clarete.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning to you all. The topic of my presentation today is about on the question of enforcing or facilitating market competition. And I focus on the case of rice in the Philippines in 2019. And as you well know, this is one, I think, of the most troubling reforms that the Philippine government had gone through and had divided basically our people on this matter. So let me start my presentation. Okay, so if you will recall, we had the rice tariffication law sometime in 2019, first quarter, February in fact. And basically, among other things, they liberalized rice imports. Now, RTL is so many things to so many people. As you may know, there were groups of people who clapped when the government enabled this, but there were also those who wanted to reverse it. So it was a very troubling times of our history. And I think it continues to be so. And I will not deal with what this law had affected our economy, but I just want to focus on a very particular issue about it, which is on prices of rice. So this is the rice price puzzle, I call it. So as you know, the rice tariffication law enabled liberalized rice imports by anyone. And rice retail prices did not fall as much. It only fell by 6% from 2018. Palay prices fell by nearly 19%. And those movements of prices basically did not dwell very well for the politics of this, because it looks like farmers are suffering more and then rice consumers did not benefit as much. And the country imported over 3 million tons in 2019, and but rice consumers seems to be not benefiting at all of this particular liberalization. Next, please. Okay, so this is a implicit computation for implicit tariff, which is basically, in layman's terms, some measure of the burden on rice consumers. So as you can see here, it's just a computation between what rice wholesale prices were in 2019 and compare this with what would be in situ warehouse cost of rice, landed cost of imported rice brought to the first warehouse. And we did have, I think, a doubling of the implicit tariff between 2018 and 2019, which is not, seems to be not what we expected for a rice tariffication law or import liberalization. But wholesale prices dropped by 23.53%. Its retail prices that did not drop as much, only by 6%. World rice prices dropped by 40%. Okay, next please. Okay, so it's kind of puzzling for me as somebody looking at this from the economics, because if we would have liberalized rice imports, we economists would say, okay, there would be many who would start importing rice because there's profit from doing so, until we wipe out profits. And that is when rice prices would have fallen to something like 26.82, which is about the world price plus the 35% tariff. But that did not happen. Wholesale prices only dropped by 20% rather than 40%. So it dropped something like around 30, if I'm not mistaken, 34.65. So anyway, and then worse, rice retail prices dropped by only 6%, which is somewhere there near 45.31. Okay, so next, please. Okay, so yeah, all right. This chart is telling us about. Let's check on the data. So we confirm now that there's about 3.1 million tons that were imported in 2019. That's about 20% of supply. There was about 12.305 million tons were harvested, according to PSA, and consumption was around 11.819 tons. It does look that this is not the version that I passed. But anyway, about 1/5 of supply was not used. Okay, so there is, I'm sorry about this, but it should be 1/5 now, because I added also the other uses of rice here. Next, please. Anyway, I can still use this particular presentation. Okay, so let's check more comprehensively the data by looking at the supply-use matrix of rice. So what do we have there? The total supply of rice is basically made up of the beginning inventory, the local rice harvested for that particular year, and imported rice. That's supply. And on the use side, we have, of course, the demand for rice, for uses for rice, for replanting, for processing, for animal feeds, and then for inventory. Okay, we have to stock up also for a variety of reasons. And finally, of course, consumption. Now, the uses of rice for planting, for processing, for animal feeds, those are in fixed proportions to local harvest. If I summed it all, nearly 12% of production would go into these other uses. That's a very steady proportion and constant through the years. It is these two elements of the use matrix, of the use of rice, that is the ending inventory and this residual and this consumption, rice as used as food. Now, the practice of PSA is to estimate IE, or the inventory. It was estimated by NFA. Now it is being estimated by, this should be BPI, and carried forward as beginning inventory in the following year. So that's estimated. I'm not sure in 2019 if they did that, because there was a transfer of responsibilities from NFA to BPI. And then consumption, or RC, the rice used as food, that's basically a residual. And but of course, it is usually checked against per capita consumption. It is rising, but not really, fluctuating left and right or up and down. So it's a very steady growth that is in step with population growth and of course, human per capita consumption. Okay, next, please. What happened here? What happened here? There's... Okay. See, there's something wrong. Okay. Sorry. I should have the one to share my... Okay. All right. Here. All right. I'll pick it up from here. Okay. Can you please project this? Hello? Do you want me to share now? Okay.
Hello, sir. You can share po your screen now.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. I should do this. Okay. All right. Okay, so let me pick up from here. All right. So given this other uses, so let me move this. This one here, if you follow my mouse, would be about one fifth of the total supply that is not used as consumption for food or other uses. Okay, so let me continue in the next slide. Next slide. Oh, okay. All right. So this one here is the supply use matrix for 2016 to 2018 coming from PSA. And as you can see, this is the uses of other percent of production of other uses. And then looks like this one is estimated by PSA to be the ending stocks. So there's an increase of about 21% of the rice inventory in 2019. And we consumed a lot, of course, higher, 13.364. So this is now the residual. So, okay, now continue. Okay. Now, this is not really something new. I mean, we had very high rice stocks, ending year rice stocks before. Like, for example, in I think this is 2010. Remember, during the Arroyo administration, we imported a lot, NFA did. And then there was lots of rice rotting in warehouses. This is this year here. The Aquino administration also had the second largest end year stocks, which is 3.4 million. Now, if PSAs would be releasing this to be the official end year stocks, this would be the third highest, which is about 3.098 million. Now, there is, however, a difference between these two. Before, it was NFA who was holding those stocks. This time, it is the private sector. NFA is still holding some stocks, but it is no longer empowered as before to participate in the market. Oops. Okay. Now, there are several motivations, of course, for holding inventories. There are useful motivations. We are holding stocks because sometime in the third quarter of the calendar year, local production is basically low. So we prepare for that so that our consumption would be smoothened. That's useful. We have been doing that. We could also have saved some rice for rainy days. But it could also mean that we are stocking, or the private sector is stocking to control the market price and get higher profits. And so this is the one that bothered several people in 2019, that it may be that traders and the importers who were the major beneficiaries of the rice tarification law. And so higher than usual inventory levels may likely indicate above normal profits. So let me point out again, the difference between before and now is that before it was the NFA who was holding the stocks. Now it's the private sector holding the stocks. And that could signal some imperfect competition, abnormal profits. So let me pursue that one, because that's a topic I have, which is, are we going to enforce competition or facilitating competition? Okay. So let me now explain the price puzzle. Remember, this is the price puzzle. Our wholesale prices dropped by 20%. Our farm gate prices dropped also by 20%, or nearly about that. But our retail prices only dropped by 6%. Okay? So something like the equilibrium seemed to be that this one here could have been the wholesale price. Okay? But then some of that were not injected in the market. So if I subtract what might be the inventory increase, its retail prices settled somewhere here, which is just 6% lower than the 2018 retail prices. Okay, because not all, if all imports, all supply were injected into the market, it would have settled here at 34.65. And I think NEDA was expecting this, but that did not happen, of course. Now, but another point I should say is, why did we settle here? In theory, we could settle here at the 26.82, which is the world price plus 35% tax, or somewhere here in between. So there's really an under importing. I mean, somewhere there is an equilibrium here, and no competition came in to basically bring down these prices further down. Okay, now let me continue with the palay prices. Now, palay prices dropped by about the same percent as wholesale prices. And the way I would explain that is, well, farmers have to unload all their harvest without access, because they don't have access to storage anyway. So buyers, the traders at the farm gate, anticipate that local rice would have to compete with imported rice. So that one is why it may have dropped about the same rate as the wholesale prices. But rice consumers did not benefit that by as much, because some of that rice did not enter into the market. Okay, so here we are now. I'm now approaching my last few slides. The question is, we could enforce competition and we could facilitate competition. Enforcing competition would be something like, now we are going to do some raids of warehouses and basically prosecute those who are hoarding rice. And we have lawyers from PCC, for example, that would charge them in violation of our local competition laws. But for me, it will bring us down all the way to the wholesale prices as we flush out all those rice from the warehouses. So we will settle from here to here. Facilitating competition would encourage more new entrants into the market. or existing players importing more. So this would possibly drive prices even much lower here, and therefore closer to the full equilibrium, which is the world price plus the 35% tax. So this one here, therefore, is increasing consumer surplus, because the consumer surplus for enforcing would just be this one. Well, the enforcing, can you follow my mouse, is larger, okay? Okay, so, therefore, enforcing competition laws by punishing by raid is not, I mean, let's look at the rice industry. This is not really an increasing returns to scale industry. It is basically a constant returns to scale industry. And there is no statute after the RTL that prevents anyone from entering this. Okay? So in theory, therefore, the equilibrium that we found in 2019 is not the sustained equilibrium, because statute as well as the nature of the industry allows entrance. But why are the entrants not entering the industry? I would call that entry cost of potential competitors in the trading business that keeps competition weak. Okay? I mean, you know, it requires some experience, some knowledge, and all this, maybe access to finance. Those things are actually barriers, effective barriers for entering the industry. So if we can reduce those entry costs, competition can be promoted. An important matter to point out is that even if the inventory were sold in the market, prices would have only fallen by 20%, half of the 40% decline in world prices in 2019. I had pointed that out in the chart earlier. Okay, before, when NFA was still a player in this market, this was not very much a problem, because NFA can countervail attempts of the private sector to corner the price by injecting rice into the market at official prices, which tends to be lower. In 2019, that role was no longer there. NFA was only instructed to procure to defend palay prices. That's why we have a lot of procurement going on here, but the release was only very low. And it appears, therefore, that NFA is like in cahoots with the private traders to corner the market, because they couldn't countervail. I mean, in fairness to the NFA, they couldn't countervail anymore because the law prevents them from doing so. So I would say that, I mean, both policy responses of enforcing as well as facilitating do encourage competition. They promote competition, and also they cost resources. I mean, PCC would have to spend resources in order to gather the evidence and prosecute those who are violating competition laws. And even facilitating competition, I mean, you have to build up the capability, capacity of our businessmen to be able to import rice, etc. So, enforcing policymakers force the traders to inject the rice into the market, further reducing rice price. However, resulting rice price will still be above the gross of tariff rice price. So, I say that this seems to be an inferior way of facilitating competition. of promoting competition. Facilitating competition would also require resources and promote competition by developing the capacity of entrants to import rice. So I made this point earlier, and let me repeat this because I think this is one of the one I would like to stress. If we just force competition, we would be settling here. But I think if we move on to facilitate competition, we could move even farther here, and there will be more competition in the market. If we look at consumer surplus as an indicator of well-being of the economy, we have a larger consumer surplus with facilitating competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clarete, for that very enlightening presentation. Now we move to the open forum for our first two speakers. Okay, so we have a question from Dr. Rodelio Subade. This is for Dr. Clarete. In retrospect and assessment, do you say that rice tariffication law was a failure? What do you think its performance was versus its goals or intentions? What do you think of its performance?
I have no doubt it was good for the economy. Even farmers who lost income in that year, okay, for most of the time, they are consumers as well. So the lower prices should benefit them also.
Okay, this is a follow-up question. I think, is the removal of countervailing role of NFA good or bad for the market? For consumers, producers? Please explain.
That particular role is like a palliative given the distorted policy of quantitative import restrictions. Okay, so that is really heavy. I mean, one wrong after another wrong. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Joel Coelho would like to ask questions. Sir, would you like to air your questions now, please?
Yes, I've got a question for both Dr. Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete. First, for Dr. Bolongaita, thank you for your insightful talk or presentation. And I really appreciated what you referred to as the rise of the algorithmic governments, which is really fascinating. And of course, that is dependent on the social license that the society is willing to offer or to give to their corresponding governments. Now, with autocratic governments like China, there's no problem with this. China can collect all the personal information of its citizens and even foreign citizens in its territory without any pushback. But when it comes to countries that are liberal democracies, even among them, there's a range. Some liberal democracies are more tolerant about encroachment into privacy. And there are countries like the United States, which is the opposite, very intolerant in regard to encroachment into personal privacy. And talking about contact tracing, because we're in the age of COVID-19, for instance, in South Korea, they've been very successful in implementing their own method of contact tracing. But I really doubt that if that is adopted to the United States, there's going to be a lot of pushback on that, because again, the level of social license differs greatly between those two liberal democracies. Can you talk a little bit more about this and give us more insight as to how governments then should approach policy depending on the degree of tolerance of their population when it comes to encroachment of privacy toward, big data and AI and all of these algorithms?
Thank you very much, Dr. Coelho, for that insightful question. The challenge for democratic governments in building social license for the deployment of analytics solutions is, as you rightly noted, much greater than it is for non-democracies. in certain democracies, and as you know, democracies are not necessarily alike. You know, there are some democracies that are sort of more consensual, as in their institutions, such as in the Scandinavian democracies, as opposed to the some other democracies that are more adversarial, you know, in nature, such as in the United States, no, and one would argue also, you know, in the Philippines and so-called, you know, presidential type of democracies. It's very interesting that the effort to build social license is not necessarily more effective in consensual democracies as opposed to non-consensual democracies. No? It might intuitively seem so, but it's not necessary. So, you know, for example, in Norway, you know, which provides funding, you know, for interest groups, no? That work, for example, on the subject of climate change. You know, studies have found that you know, the support for these groups, no, have actually created an environment that is less critical of government, no? And therefore arguably less meaningful from a public policy standpoint. You know, so there has been some, you know, perverse effects, no? With respect to the nature of the government support to generate, you know, social license for their activities. So it is you know, a very complex issue as it deals with you know, more complex tools. No? So as governments try to deploy these types of tools in a predictive manner that can have coercive, you know, consequences, you know, this can be quite challenging.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bolongaita. For Dr. Clarete, if I could turn to you now. So thank you for elucidating to us the conundrum of the rice tariffication law in the Philippines. It's quite interesting, as you mentioned, that the price of palay went down 19%, but the retail price of rice went down only by 6%. And there seems to be that missing 20% of the rice supply. So it seems to me that indeed the traders and the importers are gaming the system. So my question to you is this legal in the Philippines, or is there a way if they're hoarding and holding the supply, the 20% that seems to be missing, is there a way for law enforcement to prevent that from happening?
Thank you for that very interesting question. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, so I think that's a very challenging task for any lawyer to confront, because it's like, when you stock up, there are good reasons for storing. There could also be unproductive reasons for storing. How do you separate the two? Okay, so that is not for me to answer the question, but it is. It could be the work of the competition lawyers at the PCC.
All right.
Okay, so but definitely, if you have the evidence for it, it is really a conspiracy against the rice consumers, because it's very clearly that they have imported this at a lower price, but then they're selling it at a higher price.
And I have to know that the local farmers are at the losing end as well. Would you agree?
I agree that, because they are also consumers as well. They could have benefited more to offset their losses in income because of the competition provided by imported rice.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Coelho. Now we have Dr. Balisacan. Dr. Balisacan first, and then Dr. Mangahas and Dr. Pernia.
Thank you, Sarah. I congratulate the two speakers for very excellent presentation and very informative. Dr. Clarete, the issue of the behavior of farm prices and wholesale prices is indeed intriguing. And you referred to entry costs or barriers to entry as one plausible explanation. But could you be more specific on what those barriers to entry are? Are these barriers created by collusive behavior, or are these policy-induced barriers? Are there still, even though we said that importation has been liberalized, has indeed been de facto liberalized, is government still issuing, for example, quarantine issue, this IPS, this license to import, especially for food safety or plant safety issues or considerations, and how are these being managed with all these requests for importation? Are those where the barriers to entry are coming from? Because it's really, indeed quite intriguing. Because if you look at the number of importers during in 2019, this has increased quite significantly. But we wonder whether, of course, there's the players in the warehousing and distribution sector are the same players in the importing sector. So I think that is a good piece of information that we would need. And but the other issue is, you mentioned that there are no constant returns to scale in the industry. I think we have to be very cautious about that. It's true that in farming, the evidence shows that there are no constant returns. There are constant returns to scale there, but that's not likely to be going to be the case in warehousing and tracking segment of the market. You can see that if you go to Bulacan or Nueva Ecija, and if you look at those interlinkages of markets there, you would see that there must be scale economies there. So that's probably one thing to in fact, Yohiro Hayami mentioned this long time ago, that in the case of tracking, warehousing, marketing in agriculture, there are scale economies. But in terms of agriculture, farming itself, production itself, there's no evidence of scale economies, even in highly agricultural products of high commercial value like pineapple and banana in Mindanao. With respect to Dr. Bolongaita, I enjoyed listening to your lecture because clearly the algorithmic-based markets are quite prominent these days. And we have many issues concerning e-commerce and the use of algorithms in pricing and other market dynamics. But I was hoping to hear from you about the role of antitrust in your discussion of the policy responses of government, apart from mentioning the case in Europe. But as you, I'm sure, are aware, there is a call for a visit on the role of antitrust, even in countries like the US, where it used to be a more defensive about the role of antitrust. Now they're revisiting the practice, and many of them are now calling for a more aggressive treatment on the market with respect to antitrust or competition policy. I wonder if you can elaborate on that issue, and I'd be very thankful. Thank you.
Okay. Should I come in first? Thank you, Dr. Balisacan. You had 2 points there in your question to me. The first one is about the policy-induced barriers, and you had mentioned about the issuance of SPS permits. Those continue under the rice tariffication law or import liberalization law, because that is regarding the to protect plants from pests that may be induced by the importation. But that is an automatic import licensing. But it could be abused by BPI, as we have seen in maybe 4 or 3 years ago, when garlic imports was the issue about the issuance of SPS permits were controlled by some groups in the BPI. I think there was a court case against it. So that's precisely what we have to also watch, that there could be some cornering of the market through the issuance, lack of or slow issuance of otherwise automatic import licensing. And on the second one, I think on scale economies, I could say that I think that, yeah, I recognize that there are very large warehouses, but you can build your business, I think, when I say that it is basically constant returns to scale, the technology is such that you can scale it up. It's not like, for example, if you are going to go into real increasing returns to scale, for example, in electricity distribution, where you have to really have this kind of initial scale in order for the business to operate. So you need to have a very big, lumpy capital investments right away. But in this kind of business, in trading, you can scale it up until you can maybe start with an initial small scale of warehouse, double it, triple it, or make it a big one until when you have already the kind of experience. So that is how I see to be the kind of industry in rice. By the way, I think for the other entry barriers, I think it's basically those who are not in the business yet and they want to enter into the import business. They have to know what the importation is all about, what are the procedures, how can they access capital. So these are the kinds of capacity development, I think, that I'm talking about, that were not there in 2019 and preventing, therefore, entrants from coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balisacan, for your question. You are, I think, quite correct to point out that there is a growing effort to apply antitrust laws against big tech firms. No? Clearly, firms like Amazon have become monopolies, no? In the sense that they are able to dictate prices and exclude competition, but they are not. Being a monopoly is not necessarily a violation of antitrust laws. The question is whether their behavior and practices are actually preventing competition from other enterprises. This is where the recent hearings, actually last week, of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft were focused on, and where the regulators, based on documents from these very firms themselves, showed that there were active efforts to actually destroy competition from other firms, using, for example, early acquisition, such as arguably what Facebook did with Instagram. And so you're, I think, absolutely correct that we will see increasing attempts at regulation of big tech, but as I think you would be well aware, the power of these big tech, to deploy their own, legal capacities to counter regulatory attempts to constrain them would be quite formidable. It'll be battle royale.
Dr. Mangajas, your questions, please.
Yeah. I made a comment there that I think that price tariffication worked because hunger was very low in December 2019. Now, I'd like to explain that hunger has been measured directly by surveys quarterly since 1998. On the other hand, rice consumption is very irregularly measured and not directly. It's only a residual. So actually, we don't know the real evidence as to how much people are eating in terms of food at all. Now, Dennis Mapa, when he was with the School of Statistics, and his students, in fact, had so many papers showing that the time trend of hunger was closely related to the price of rice. No? In fact, he estimated lags in terms of the effect of the price of rice on hunger using our estimates of hunger and the estimates of the price of rice, which are, of course, easy to estimate. It's easy to observe the price of rice. Even this year, 2020, we have already done 2 surveys of hunger by including them in our mobile phone surveys. So we have not stopped with the surveying of hunger. Okay. Now, what's the general time pattern of hunger? Hunger was relatively low 1998 up to 2003. Then it went up steadily from 2004 and hit a peak about 2014, 15. I call it the hump in hunger. In 2013, 14, we had 20% hunger in the Philippines. Now that sort of simmered down a little bit, 2015, 2016, 17, and finally, as I said, hit this low of 8.8% at the end of 2019. That's a great relief. That's the most important achievement in terms of the food security issue for the people. But unfortunately, this year, because of the breakup in people's livelihoods, we had hunger zooming up again to 17 or 16% in May, and then 20% plus by July. All right, but that's not due to the price of rice. That's due to the sudden squelch in people's incomes. All right, so to my mind, it's you look at both the prices and you look at the ability to purchase. And this year, it's the ability to purchase which is squeezing people. And for goodness sake, why doesn't the government put some statistical resources into measuring hunger itself directly? Measuring food consumption is actually very, very difficult, to do regularly. But if you're going to do it only once every few years, I think that's hopeless. Measure hunger too. Use whatever you like to do, but go directly into measuring hunger. That's the real test of what's happening to food security. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we move on to Dr. Pernia's questions, would you like to comment on that, Dr. Clarete?
No, I think
Okay.
I'll comment maybe later.
Dr. Pernia, your questions
Yeah,
answered.
okay, just a couple of quick questions, which will require also very quick answers. On the rice liberalization law, people seem to be very happy about the law because rice prices have really plummeted, and in fact, in terms of the overall inflation, headline inflation, it has been a material contributor to the downtrend in headline inflation. So, are you saying that by not just enforcing but also facilitating competition. It will further reduce rice prices and therefore lower overall inflation in general. So that's my question on the rice thing. On Dr. Bolongaita's presentation, I think you mentioned that the contact tracing using technology, the big data and all that, in Korea was very successful. And I think in a couple of other countries as well. But how is it that it's not being used in Australia, in Victoria? There has been a surge in cases, COVID cases in Victoria, right? And even the US has not been using contact tracing by adopting technology. So it's really, and of course in the Philippines, we're not using it either. So it's a mystery to me why it's so simple to use contact tracing using technology, but it's not being used. So thank you. That's all.
Yeah, Dr. Pernia, to the question, yes. There's when I computed the implicit tariff based on the retail prices that went down only by 6%, or even the wholesale price 20, which is went up by 20%. I mean, it's still around 74%. Okay, is the implicit tariff. I mean, that's the burden that consumers have to shoulder. In other words, there is still room for bringing it down if there were more businessmen who will enter the business of trading, importing.
Thank you, Sec Ernie, for your question. The contact tracing app in Australia called COVID Safe app, was very successfully rolled out. The design, at the outset looked really strong in terms of the privacy considerations, and the social marketing to build social license was highly effective, and the government was able to, within just 2 weeks, achieve their target of almost 40%, and now it's past 40% of the Australian population with smartphones. However, it turns out that there's a technical defect in the app itself, no? And it turns out that the Bluetooth handshake that is on which the contact tracing depends does not work very well when iPhones are locked. And this partly explains why none of the people who have been infected with COVID in Australia, very, very few have actually been found as a result of the contact tracing app. So it's been called now by the opposition here as a big failure of an app. Unlike how it has done, unlike how such apps have done in elsewhere, such as in South Korea, as you mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for such a stimulating open forum. Should you have any more questions, you can either write them on the chat board. We can read them later in the second open forum.
Answer my question. Ramon has not commented yet on my mic.
So you may air, if you have any questions, so further questions for our two speakers, you may air them orally later in the second open forum after all the presenters are done. Thank you again to our speakers, Dr. Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete. Now we move on to our third speaker. I'm sorry, on the chat board, this is my boss. Dr. Concepcion, Dr. Gislala Concepcion has a question for Dr. Bolongaita.
Oh, thank you. This is quick. I wanted to congratulate both speakers, but in particular, I wanted to ask Emil, as an academic leader, how are you addressing the ethical questions regarding AI data analytics as a major tool in governance? How are you addressing keeping the balance between private individual interest and public interest? Thank you.
Oh, you're asking the $1 billion question, Professor Concepcion. Indeed, the development and deployment of increasingly, AI-driven tools, that not just use machine learning but deep learning, will really put us into ethical territory in highly complex ways, especially as the development of these tools can even lead to situations where even the designers are not quite sure about how the machines are learning and making prescriptions and decisions. So the realm of ethics and accountability is where I think policymakers and regulators are going to be wrestling with going forward. And this, obviously, as you know, will lead policymakers and regulators and citizens to the issue of values, no? And what values do we have to make sure are protected as we design and develop these tools?
Sarah, could I just quickly, very short, respond to Dr. Mangahas? I do agree with your comment about I'm not happy with how consumption is measured as a residual. These two, in the stocks held and then the consumption held, these are the two things that are very important to understand. And I think if we can just have direct estimation of consumption, as you suggest, maybe the hunger index that you have, and link that to consumption, that would be, I think, a better way of understanding more our statistics. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move again? If you have any further questions, you may air them in the second open forum after all the speakers are done. Our third presenter is Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. He was awarded the National Academy of Science and Technology Outstanding Young Scientist in Economics in 2014. He specializes in applied econometrics with focus on labor and migration, education, poverty, and inequality. Please welcome with me Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes.
Good morning. Can you hear me? So it's an honor to be presenting here together with colleagues and other esteemed guests. I will be presenting on the estimated impact on Philippine employment and poverty of COVID-19 and the lockdown. So let me just note first that my presentation is based on some ongoing and completed research, mainly this, including a paper I'm currently writing with Professor Arsenio Balisacan, currently of the Philippine Competition Commission. The structure of my presentation will be as follows. So first, I will give an introduction. Here, I will define the measures of poverty which I will use, and describe the mechanism by which COVID-19 affects household income and poverty. Next, I will describe the documented impact of COVID-19 on employment based on the most recent labor force survey. I will then present the results of our estimation of the impact of COVID-19 on income poverty, and then present on the further welfare effects of COVID-19, especially on education enrollment. Finally, I will give a summary and recommendations. So COVID-19 is a health pandemic that is causing social and economic crisis everywhere in the world, including the Philippines. So we now have a keen awareness of its economic impact, but I think we are only seeing the beginnings of its social consequences. From our own experiences, of course, we know that it has affected how we relate to other people, constrained the activities we can take part in, and the things we can enjoy, As I will discuss, it has also had an extraordinary effect on employment. This, of course, we can also see with our own eyes, and we think it will have an extraordinary effect also on poverty, as we should expect. It will also have an impact on other aspects of well-being, such as on the education of the young, non-COVID-19 health outcomes, and even our psychological well-being. Forecasts made by multilateral organizations as of June 2020 predicts the world economy will decline by about 5% this year. If you have been following the forecast, you will realize that as time goes by, the forecasts keep getting worse. So this is likely going to go down further. The International Labour Organization estimates that about 400 million full-time jobs were lost worldwide in the second quarter of the year. And that while some recovery is likely to occur during the rest of the year, by the fourth quarter of 2020, it is still projected that employment will be down about 140 million full-time jobs. This is for the world. The COVID-19 induced economic crisis is unlike economic crises in recent history, such as the global financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis, in the severity and the spread of its effect. It really affects all economies, whether advanced, emerging, or developing. Note that before the crisis, global economic output was expected to grow by more than 3%. So now, it is expected to contract by 5%. This means that global output this year is more than 8% lower than it likely would have been without COVID-19. Advanced economies are projected to contract by 8% this year, with output 10% lower than without COVID-19. Emerging and developing markets in general, contraction of 3%, and output 8% lower than without COVID-19. Emerging and developing Asia, where we belong, expected contraction of only 1%, but 7% lower than without COVID-19. Because of course, developing countries were also expected to grow much faster. The IMF expects the Philippines to contract this year by 2% compared to an initial projected growth of more than 6%. By now, this will be considered a very optimistic projection. Some analysts forecast the economy will contract by more than 6% this year. So that will be a 12% decline for what was expected before COVID-19. So let me go to the presentation proper. So COVID-19 will impact poverty mainly through its impact on employment and loss of earnings. There are three main mechanisms by which COVID-19 impacts employment. The first is through lockdowns. Of course, at the moment, we're beginning another modified ECQ. So lockdowns imposed either nationally or at local levels to control the spread of the virus. Lockdowns, of course, as we know and as we have experienced, it immediately forces workers, regardless of the sector of employment, and excluding only those classified as essential workers, from either working. So they force workers to either work from home or not work at all during the extent of the lockdown. But of course, we know that some work cannot actually be done from home. The second is through the social or physical distancing required even after a lockdown has ended, or even in the absence of a lockdown policy. So for as long as no vaccine is developed. Included here are travel restrictions to prevent infections coming from abroad. This affects work that is contact intensive or that requires people to congregate in a closed or relatively small area. This includes jobs in restaurants, shopping centers, airlines, and cruise ships, public transportation, sports and concert arenas, spas, barbershops, and beauty salons, among others. The third is via the reduction in aggregate demand due to reduced purchasing power within country and abroad, because domestic income will decline as people lose jobs, meaning people who earn less or nothing in the Philippines will also spend less, but also because of lower remittances from abroad, as many OFWs are displaced. So there will be less remittances for domestic consumption. As of remittances declined by more than 6% compared to April last year, and a declining remittances is expected for the rest of the year. And also because of lower foreign income, which means lower demand for Philippine exports. So this will all impact household income. What has actually happened to employment in the Philippines? So far, what we have is information from the April 2020 labor force survey. So this was during the height of the Luzon lockdown. So this is probably the employment picture at its worst. The number of people who were employed or had jobs in 2019. So the number of employed went down by 5 million in the services sector and more than 2 million in the industry sector. There was in comparison only a relatively small decline in agricultural employment. Considering that every year, the number of employed usually goes up by more than 1 million, then that's another million potential jobs that were also lost. By subsector, there were large job losses in construction. That's more than 2.4 million jobs lost. Wholesale and retail trade, more than 2 million jobs lost. Foundation and food service activities and other service activities. Other service activities include laundry, barbers, beauty shops, computer repairs. But there's more. Among the employed, there are also those who reported they had a job, but in fact did no work and likely earned no income. Such would be the case for those I would refer to as non-regular employees who were paid either per day or per hour or per piece of output or on a pakyawan or on commission basis, which are the great majority of employees. They comprise more than, or they make up more than 60% of employees. So there were an estimated 12.5 million workers who reported having a job but not having done any work due to the lockdown or COVID-19. Assuming conservatively that only half of them did not receive any income, because of course not all companies can afford to pay per day workers when they're not actually producing any output, then that is equivalent to about 6 million workers severely affected by COVID-19 and the lockdown. And in fact, there's more. One also has to include farmers and fishermen who might have worked but were not able to sell their produce or catch because they could not transport them during the lockdown, and also overseas Filipino workers who lost their jobs, some of whom have already returned to the country. According to POAA, Philippine Overseas Employment Administration displaced as of July. I think more recent estimates put it at more than 200,000 already. And of this displaced, about 50,000 have already returned to the Philippines, have been repatriated. There are good reasons to think that these job losses have had a big impact on poverty, or will have a big impact on poverty. One of those is that the job losses appears to have disproportionately affected those with lower education. So there was more than a 300% increase in the number of unemployed who only had elementary education or less. There was more than a 250% increase in the number of unemployed who only had junior high school education or less. The increase in unemployment among those with higher education were also high, but lower in comparison. So there are many ways in which poverty can be measured, although income poverty is what I will focus on in this presentation. There's also, of course, self-rated poverty, as reported on a quarterly basis by the social weather stations. Then there is multidimensional poverty, usually a composite of education, health, and income measures. And then income poverty, which is based on a comparison of income, of household per capita income against a poverty line or threshold. But then you can also have different $2 a day poverty line used by the World Bank for inter-country comparisons. But here we use official poverty lines or thresholds. So the poverty line by definition is the amount computed by our government statisticians to be just sufficient to meet the most basic food and non-food needs. The Philippine Statistics Authority has a different poverty line for each province. Let me also note that in the succeeding simulations, we also measure poverty at the level of households rather than individuals. The only major difference is that poverty will be higher when measured at the level of individuals compared to households, since poor households usually have more members, but otherwise the patterns will be similar. So these are the measures of poverty we will be using. So first is poverty incidence, also known as headcount ratio. It is just the percentage of households with per capita income below the poverty line. We will also use the poverty gap index, which is a measure of the shortfall of the total population from the poverty line. There is a related measure that we will also use, index for the poor, which is the average shortfall of the poor from the poverty line. So it's the poor only, looking at the poor only. And finally, poverty severity, or the squared poverty gap, which is a measure of the inequality among the poor. So in our simulations, we use Monte Carlo simulations using national representative household and income. So we use information from the April 2020 labor force survey on the characteristics of those who lost jobs. So this, the Monte Carlo simulations tries to address the lack of exact knowledge as to which individuals will lose their jobs by making it probabilistic, but doing it repeatedly. So in particular, we will use the linked family income and expenditure survey and labor force survey. So meaning they are the same household, the same individuals. So poverty statistics are based on the PAASE, which only comes out every 3 years. The most recent one is 2018. The next one is for 2021, which will only come out possibly in early 2023. But for this exercise, we calibrate it to the 2018 income distribution, because we need a PAASE that can be linked to the labor force survey, and the 2018 PAASE LFS link file is not yet available. So this is what we do. So we assume that individuals who earn wages or entrepreneurial income earn this at a uniform rate over the course of the year, and that the effects of the ECQ and COVID-19 are implemented in the form of job loss among workers using the information from the ELV. We do a random assignment of who among workers by level of education lose their jobs due to the ECQ and COVID-19. And then we take into account the more than 2 months of full lockdown that actually happened. So job loss is not assumed to disappear just because the lockdown is ended. But after the full lockdown, we assume there's a linear recovery in employment until job loss is reduced to 1/3 of its full lockdown level by the end of the year. So gradual decline in job loss. So over the course of the year, people recovered jobs, but not to the full extent. Only 2/3 of those who lose their jobs recover them by the end of the year. So again, we do random assignment of who among the workers by education level lose jobs due to the ECQ using Monte Carlo simulations. Then we average the results for 30 simulations. We've actually also done it for 100, but there's really very little difference. So to save time, we just did it for 30 simulations. Then these are the results. So these simulations assume the absence of any transfers, whether from government or a private source, but also implicitly assumes that households can tap into their savings or borrow from some source, either other households or some financial institutions, so that they are able to spread out their consumption over the course of the year. So this figure shows the results for poverty incidence. So without transfers from government or other sources, poverty incidence can rise from the baseline level of 14%, that's without COVID-19, to about 21%, equivalent to about 2 million more poor households, about 10 million poor individuals. So this is a 50% increase in poverty incidence. The effect on poverty gap expected to almost double, indicating that the population on average is farther from the poverty line. In fact, if you look at the poverty gap only among the poor, what you see is that the poverty gap among the poor increases from about 22% to 27%. So meaning that without COVID-19, the poor will be about, the per capita incomes of the poor will be about 22% away from the poverty line. After COVID-19, they will be 27% away from the poverty line. So if you combine this with the information from the previous slide, so this means that not only will there be more poor, but on average, they will be farther from the poverty line. Next is poverty severity. So the estimated increase in poverty severity is also very high. So that's more than double, which means that there will also be more inequality among the poor, or more extreme poverty. So next, what we did was we ran further simulations. An obvious one, of course, will be in the Bayanihan, there was a 2-month cash grant given to about 18 million low-income households. What will be the effect of that on poverty? So, assuming perfect targeting, meaning that all the social amelioration program funds go to the poorest 18 million households, and that there's no corruption, the result is this on poverty incidence. So poverty incidence will be 18% rather than 21%. So it will mitigate the effect on poverty, but not fully offset the effect of COVID-19 and the ECQ. So this is true regardless of which measure of income poverty you look at, whether it is poverty gap, so lower poverty gap, but still higher than baseline, poverty gap among the poor, and poverty severity. Of course, there were also other help that was available from the private sector and also from LGUs, not just the Bayanihan cash grant. So overall, there's probably more mitigation. But I still think not enough to fully offset the impact of COVID-19, as these other interventions are smaller in scale. Also, of course, we know that there was probably some corruption in the distribution of the funds, and also there was a long delay. In fact, some households report not having received any at all, even though they were likely very low income households. So we also simulate the effect of the impact of possible increases in prices, in particular food prices. So this relates to the earlier presentation of Dr. Clarete. So we simulate the effect of a rise in food inflation, just to highlight how important it is to make sure that the supply chain works. So we simulated the effect of a 5%, 10%, and 15% rise in food inflation above the normal. So normally, food prices increase by about only 2% to 2.5% every year. So anything above that we consider as extraordinary rise in food inflation. So what we found was that, well, of course, higher food inflation would result in greater poverty because it will impact the poverty threshold, and that a 15% above normal food inflation would completely offset the effect of the Bayanihan 2-month cash grant. So we have other simulations, but I will not show them anymore. This is just to show that among the poor or poverty severity. So COVID-19 affects not only employment and income, but also other aspects of household welfare. So apart from its effect on income, or directly following its effect on income, COVID-19 can also, for example, affect health and education outcomes. And the effect is likely to be felt even beyond this year. So for example, COVID-19 is likely to reduce access to health services for non-COVID-19 patients, which is likely to lower future health outcomes for many people. And for example, it also has it is expected to have a big effect on education outcomes. For example, we are already seeing that COVID-19 is reducing enrollment at all levels of education. So this, combined with the rapid shift to distance learning, will likely have long-term consequences and reduce educational outcomes for current students. The reduced enrollment currently being observed, I will show them in the next slide, are likely to stem from the following reasons. So, access to digital technology needed for online learning might be reluctant to send their children to school, instead choosing to wait it out. Also, parents' fear of infection for their children and family. Things are uncertain enough that face-to-face classes is still a possibility at least early next year. Finally, lower household incomes are also likely impacting enrollment. If you look at the available data, among the out-of-school youth, majority, the reason they give for not going to school is still economic. Either their household does not have enough income, or they're actually already working. This is because there's actual cost to sending children to school, even if tuition is free. And of course, we also know that there is opportunity cost. Given the current hardships, parents could decide that the chance of getting employment for their family will be higher with more of the household members available for work, including children. So for example, this is based on the DepEd reported data as of end July. So enrollment in K-12 was lower by about 5 million students as of end July. Enrollment level is back to where it was 12 years ago. That's the enrollment level. If you look at the rate, it is set back even further. Of course, there is now a larger student age population. The fall in enrollment is also occurring at all basic education levels. So it appears many parents have decided to delay entry of their children to kindergarten. For this and other students who will be dropping out, it will be more difficult for them to get back to school later. So access is lower, but so will quality most probably as schools adopt distance learning. Very few households among the lower income groups have ownership of personal computers and broadband access. And although many households own cell phones and could potentially avail of mobile data, the cost is prohibitive for poor households. So for example, in this table, you look at the last column, that's there, in the poorest income decile, 76% of households have either postpaid or prepaid communication expenses. And so the possibility of mobile data access. But actually, if you look at the actual expenditure, 50 pesos. So probably not utilizing mobile data. So to summarize, COVID-19 has had a tremendous negative impact on employment and potentially very large effect on poverty, possibly reversing all the gains in poverty achieved since 2012. Its effect on employment has been highly unequal, disproportionately affecting those with lower education and lower income in the first place. It is setting back enrollment in basic education by more than a decade. The Bayanihan Cash Grant helped, but we know that potentially there was a significant leakage since number of households covered was already more than 70% of all households in the country. Meanwhile, for really poor recipient households, grant was probably inadequate because of fixed amount per household, 5,000 to 8,000, which was only adequate for a family of size 4 in NCR and family of size 3 elsewhere. But in fact, the average size of poor households is about 6. There's, of course, also a delay in distribution of the cash grants, which likely caused a lot of hunger and distress because large number of households are in danger of immediate poverty. They probably do not have any savings and have poor access on the report of Dr. Mangajas. So some recommendations, an extension of support to affected low income households, so further bayanihan. But there is a need for timeliness and better targeting of those really in need and making sure there is no duplication, which was a problem with the previous thing. For PAASE to further incentivize parents to keep their children in school. So this can be in the form of increasing the cash incentives to parents or increasing the number of households covered by for PAASE. Also expand access to digital technology to enable the poor to participate in online learning. To avail of health services like telemedicine, avail of government services, and possibly to help them generate opportunities for livelihood. Also, ensure inflation is under control, especially for food, which figures heavily in the consumption basket of the poor. This means ensuring supply chain is working properly and that farmers have the capital to engage in their usual production. I would also recommend employment support programs, including emergency employment and retraining for workers in sectors unlikely to recover soon. And improve social protection programs for the working poor, especially those in self-employment. So I will recommend, for example, a subsidized social security or at least consider this to get a ready safety net during crisis. I will also recommend the establishment of unemployment insurance which is already in place in other ASEAN countries, the Philippines, for example, Lao PDR and Vietnam. And of course, economic recovery will ultimately be necessary. So expansionary fiscal and monetary policies will be important as well. But I think some of this will be discussed by the presenters later. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for that very informative, enlightening discussion. We move on to our fourth presenter. Dr. Majah-Leah V. Ravago is Associate Professor at the Department of Economics, Ateneo de Manila University. Her research interests include energy economics, economics of natural disasters, development economics, and resource economics. She was the program director of the 2014 to 2018 USAID grant, Energy Policy and Development Program, or EPDP. She served as the president of the Philippine Economic Society in 2018. She received the 1 UP Faculty Grant Award in Economics for Outstanding Research and Public Service in UP Diliman. This was in 2016 to 2018, when she was assistant professor at the UP. In 2016, she was awarded the Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology. She earned her BS in Business Economics and MA Economics from the University of the Philippines. She obtained her PhD Economics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2012 under the East-West Center Graduate Degree Fellowship Program. Please welcome with me Dr. Majah-Leah Ravago.
Good morning. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks to you and Dr. Concepcion for inviting me to be part of this session. So this paper is co-written with Professor James Rumaset from the University of Hawaii. Okay. The Philippines Medium-Term Development Plan for 2017 to 2022 is anchored on Ambisyon Natin 2040, which targets attaining a high income target for the Philippines in 2040. In fact, the country is poised to meet this target. The Philippine economy is on a high trajectory since the beginning of the current decade. For the period of 2010 to 2019, the average growth was 6.3%, which is the highest 7-year average since the mid-1970s. And concerns about attracting generation investment is what we have before 2020 because electricity consumption was expected to grow to nearly 4 times its 2018 level by 2040. Now, come 2020, enter the COVID-19 pandemic, and the forecast for the Philippines turned sour, falling into negative territory to as low as here 7%. Okay, now, it is commonly believed that because of its low fuel cost, high plant cost, and high ramping inefficiencies, the least cost generation mix involved using coal as the baseload fuel. So we have here on the graph is the load profile for any time of the day, and you have here the baseload, which is coal, because it has the comparative advantage in serving the minimum load over a typical 24-hour period, such that it can run at a nearly constant rate at or near maximum capacity. In contrast, you have here the open cycle gas turbine plants because it's low plant cost and greater ramping flexibility. And you have here the CCGT, or the combined cycle gas turbine, because it has a high plant cost and also greater ramping flexibility. Now the question is, how do we determine the least cost mix, or how do we know when CCGT will supplement the baseload coal and when do we use the fast peaking plants OCGT? The economist Josco proposed to use screening curves. Now, what is screening curves? It's a screening curves plot average cost as the linear function of annualized fixed cost plus variable cost per hour times the number of hours used. So this one determines at what load per hour the base load generation begins to be supplemented by the intermediate fuel type, and when those two are further supplemented by the peaking fuel type. So in another paper, I written it here, we did the analysis and apply screening curve for Luzon. So this one. So applying the analysis and projecting the demand up to 2025 and including pollution costs, what we found is that coal is the least cost generating fuel for the low demand hours of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. So this means that for the other hours, it should be supplemented by intermediate peaker plants, and for the peaker demands of 1 and 2 p.m., it will be supplemented by the fast peaker plants. Note that what is run during the base load can be run all day. Now, during the lockdown, we of course know that demand falls. Now there is excess capacity. The problem becomes choosing which plant to use and which to leave idle. So from the screening analysis, it suggests that coal would be the sole generating source of for more hours of the day. Now, in reality, just the opposite happened. So we see here that coal generation fell dramatically from 56% to 48%. Why this paradoxical result? There are two reasons. One is the inflexibilities in legal rules and contracts. RE's renewable energy source are assured mass dispatch status as per the Renewable Energy Law of 2008. Thus, the system operator is required to accept whatever is generated. Second, there's inflexibilities of the supply of gas arriving by pipeline. So we have these take or pay bilateral contracts with Meralco that assure minimum purchases of natural gas generation, which reflect this inflexibility in gas delivery. Now, this leaves the burden of adjustment falling on coal plants, a number of which have had to temporarily shut down production. Now, turning to the effect of lockdown on electricity prices. Okay, so wholesale rates on the spot market fell by 55% during the lockdown period. And then going to the retail rates, specifically for Meralco service area, we actually saw an increase from March to April, but this is really due to the normalization of the universal charge rate. Please also note that in April, ERC suspended the collection of the feed-in tariff allowance in our bill. Then in May and June, we see here a decline in the retail rates for Meralco because they have availed the force majeure provisions in their PSA, thus allowing them to pay a lower fixed charge, which reflected in our bill. Now, given this, we still had the bill shock or the electric shock, right? So what Meralco did is to use the December to February average to bill customers for March and April. In fairness to Meralco, they are just really following what is stated in the distribution code. There's a provision in the distribution code that was issued by the ERC. Now, why the widespread confusion and complaints? I think the shortcoming of Meralco is that while they announced that they're going to use the 3-month average, it was not, I guess, appropriately communicated that when the lockdown is to be lifted, we will be billed, okay, or there will be some adjustment in the actual consumption that we had. Please note that when the lockdown happened, we have also experienced a very high temperature. In fact, international observers are calling it extreme heat wave. So if you look at the electricity consumption last year for 2019, Meralco is averaging December here, January and February of 2019. If you look at the consumption in April and May, our consumption is really much higher. So thus, when the actual electricity consumption was billed to us in May when the lockdown was lifted, now complaints ensued. Okay, so pursuant to Machiavellian credo of never letting a crisis go to waste, some observers advocate acceleration of the transition away from coal towards renewable. This is actually specified in the RE Law of 2008, wherein it's specified as an aspirational target of 35% renewable by the year 2030. Now, looking at the share of renewables in dependable capacity, it's already here, it's already at 31%, okay? But the DOE rules specified that the 35% should be attained in terms of generation. So in terms of generation, what we have here is 23.4%, which is somewhat more difficult to attain. Now, given the gap, 35% versus the 23% in the aqua generation, the question is, are subsidies for RE still necessary? So note that the lesser levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar for the US are already below those of coal and natural gas. The cost of intermittency are quite modest, given the abundant opportunities for diversification, the falling cost of battery storage, and possibilities for demand management. Greater renewable mandates and subsidies could compromise the objectives of affordability, reliability, and security embodied in the EPIRA and also in the Tax Reform Act of 2017. Mandates and subsidies also put RE advocates at loggerheads with the DOE's declared technology neutral policy. So given this, given that the solar is so cheap and its intermittency manageable, the question is, why is adoption so slow in the Philippines? Is FIT, the feed-in tariff subsidies, are actually retarding the transition? Now, pitting consumer welfare against the environment is a false dichotomy. Consumer welfare is maximized by the least cost generation mix after including the social cost of pollution. Given the rapid reduction in solar costs, diversification possibilities, demand management, and cheaper storage, the transition towards renewable is coming. We are not denying that. The role of government is to facilitate an efficient energy transition and not to force it prematurely with costly subsidies. Now, one might ask, what do we mean by this efficient energy transition? Okay, by efficient, we mean the least social cost. So the efficient energy transition should take into account the falling cost of wind and solar and the low cost of managing intermittency. Taxes should reflect the marginal damage cost of pollution, especially from generation with coal. The coal and petroleum excise taxes are part of the 2017 tax reform. So this is already a step towards the right direction. Pollution taxes can harmonize the quest for renewability with affordability and other objectives of EPIRA. So it's just really leveling the playing field. The social cost of pollution, which is included here when we determine the least social cost, this includes both domestic costs from carbon emissions and the cost of local pollutants that impinge on health. The local pollutants include the sulfur oxide, nitrous oxides, and particulate matter. These local pollutants are actually far more costly. The damage cost add-on for natural gas is very small compared to coal. Existing subsidies should be phased out in accordance with competitive cost wind and solar power. Other policies can complement the ability of the market system to deliver energy efficiently. One would be safeguarding competition by free entry and generation and into generation and retailing. Another is the planning of investment in transmission in accordance with generation investments that minimize social costs and not according to investors' demand, as what happened in Negros. Aligning retail rates more closely with marginal costs, including real-time pricing, can lower the cost on intermittency, lower rates, and deliver greater benefits from the power system. Some concluding remarks. Given that utility-scale wind and solar projects are cost competitive with coal and natural gas, probably or perhaps an investigation is needed into the relatively small investments into those sources. It is likely that bureaucratic requirements of FIT subsidies are actually retarding investment relative to free market levels. Existing coal plants and some new LNG plants can be part of an efficient transition towards renewable. And as a final remark, using COVID-19 to justify further subsidies is likely to be counterproductive. So we did this commentary and it's published in the East Asia Forum magazine, and an elaboration of this commentary is released as a working paper at the Ateneo. This is posted at the Ateneo de Manila Department of Economics website. And as forgive me for the shameless advertisement, our book is still available at the UP Press online store. Monching, Jeff, and Sarah have all their respective chapters in this book. So thank you very much. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Maha. Yes, I'll be presenting next. Now I have, for the first time now, I've pre-recorded my presentation.
Before you present, Sarah, let me say something about you, if I may. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sarah Lynne Salvador Daway-Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, from which she also obtained her bachelor's in economics degree, summa cum laude, in 2003, and a master's economics degree in 2005. She earned her PhD economics from the University of California, Riverside in 2012. Until recently, she held the position of UP School of Economics Research Director and was an executive editor of the Journal of Asian Economics. She is currently a board member of the Philippine Economic Society. Her research interests include macroeconomic theory, monetary theory, and policy and related topics in development economics. Dr. Daway-Ducanes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Gisela, for that generous introduction. So as I said earlier, I've pre-recorded my presentation. Thank you.
Good morning again to everyone. This is a short presentation on COVID-19 and the external threats posed by its effects on the Philippine economy. I focus on two external threats, namely the threat to remittances and to tourism. The outline of the presentation is as follows. We first look at the contribution of remittances and tourism to the Philippine economy. We then focus on remittances and tourism in 2019, and then lay out the outlook on these sectors for 2020. Using an input-output framework, we then present the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances and tourism due to COVID-19. And finally, we briefly discuss some policy implications. Tourism and remittances are both important to the Philippine economy, each making up a substantial portion of GDP. In 2019, tourism direct gross value added was at around 2.5 trillion pesos, making up about 12.7% of GDP. Inbound, or foreign tourism expenditures, were at 549 billion pesos. This is about 15% of total tourism expenditures in the country. While domestic tourism expenditures, that is, tourism expenditures made by residents, were at about 3.14 trillion pesos, which is about 85% of total tourism expenditures. The tourism sector employed around 5.71 million workers, making up about 13.5% of total employment in 2019. In the same year, remittances were at 1.70 trillion pesos, making up around 8.7% of GDP. Cash remittances, which are remittances coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, were at 1.53 trillion pesos, or 7.8% of GDP. Now, in times past, remittances have been observed to act as buffers against economic downturns. Relatives residing and working abroad tend to remit money to relatives in need during difficult times, thereby promoting consumption stability amongst remittance-receiving households in the Philippines. In the couple of years leading to the pandemic, remittances have been purported to fund investments in real estate, housing, and spending on consumer durables. As mentioned earlier, cash remittances reached around $30 billion, equivalent to 1.53 trillion pesos. Now, cash remittances are remittances that are coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, that is, remittance centers like LBC Pera Padala, pawn shops, etc. Land-based sources accounted for 78% of total remittances, whereas sea-based sources, primarily from incomes remitted by Filipino seafarers, accounted for 22% of cash remittances. In 2019, 42% of cash remittances, or 643 billion pesos, came from the Americas, around 90% of which came from the US, 22% from Asia, 20% from the Middle East, 13% from Europe, 3% from Oceania, and 0.01% from Africa. The pie chart here shows the expenditures of a remittance-receiving household. This is based on the 2015 Family Income and Expenditure Survey. Food and beverages had the largest share, at 29% of total expenditures, followed by housing, rent, and utilities, 25%, miscellaneous goods and services and other disbursements, 20%. Now notice that education made up only about 4.4%, while health made up only 3% of total expenditures. Transport expenditures made up an even larger share of 4.9%, while recreation, culture, accommodation, special family occasion was at 3.2% and higher than health expenditures. The pie chart here shows the profile of inbound tourism expenditures. Using 2018 expenditure shares, accommodation services for visitors had the largest share at around 25%. This is followed by food and beverage serving services at 24%, then by transport services at 23%, entertainment and recreation services 14%, shopping 11%, miscellaneous goods and services 2%, and spending on travel agencies and other reservation services at 1%. We now discuss the outlook for remittances and tourism in 2020 in the face of the COVID-19 generated crisis. The table here shows the top 10 remittance sources in 2019. Together, these 10 countries were the source of 1.20 trillion pesos, or 78% of total cash remittances. 574 billion pesos, or 35%, came from the US, followed by 7% from Saudi Arabia, 6% each from Singapore and Japan, 5% each from the UAE and the UK, and 3% each from Canada, Hong Kong, Germany, and Kuwait. However, due to COVID-19, these countries are themselves facing dismal economic growth prospects. The quarter one year-on-year growth rate of US GDP was at negative 5%, negative 1% for Saudi Arabia, negative for the rest of the other top remittance sources. The IMF GDP growth outlook for 2020 for these countries is also dire, ranging from negative 1.1% to negative 7%. The US, our biggest remittance source, is expected to suffer a negative 5.9% decline in GDP growth for the entire year. Indeed, before the pandemic, in January and February 2020, Remittances rose 6.6% and 2.5% year-on-year, respectively. In March, remittances were down by 4.7%, rounding up the year-on-year Q1 growth of remittances to just about 1.5%, compared to the 4.1% Q1 growth of remittances in 2019. In April, remittances dropped further from $2.44 billion to $2.05 billion, a 16.2% year-on-year decline. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or the BSP, forecasts a 5% drop in remittances, equivalent to around 0.4% of GDP. Now, JICA, or the Japan International Cooperation Agency, forecasts quite a large drop of around 33%, while the Department of Labor and Employment's forecast is not far behind at around 40%. Thus, remittances are expected to decline somewhere between 5 to 40%, which is quite a wide range. To make some sense of these estimates, let's do some back-of-the-envelope computations. In 2019, OFW remittances for 6 months, from April to September, were at 212 billion pesos. Now, assuming that OFW remittances for the entire year is just double this, that would give us about 424 billion pesos for the entire year. As of today, there are about 500,000 OFWs that have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. They make up about 23% of the 2.2 million OFWs estimated by the Philippine Statistics Authority. Thus, expected OFW remittance losses for 2020 are about 3/4 or 424 billion pesos times 23%, which gives us about 72 billion pesos, making up about 4.73% of 2019 remittances. However, these are only remittances from OFWs. Around 72% of remittances are transfers made by non-residents, mainly Filipinos who have become residents of the countries where they are now working at, to Filipino households. Given the World Bank's forecast of a global decline of around 5.2%, this brings the expected remittance losses from other sources by about 57 billion pesos, around 3.76% of 2019 remittances. So adding up 3.76% and 4.73% gives us around 8.5%. This is the expected decline in remittances, OFW remittances, and remittances from other sources in 2020. Alternatively, we can have the following computations. In Q1, remittances grew by about 1.5%. Now, in April, remittances declined by 16.18%. Now, suppose that the May and June growth rates are the same as in April, so that's 16.18% decline, and 10% for the rest of the year. So doing the computations, we arrive at negative 8.68% decline in remittances for 2020, or that's around 9% decline in remittances for the entire year. Now we go to the tourism outlook for 2020. Tourist arrivals all over the world dropped by as much as 57% in March, according to the UNWTO, or UN World Tourism Organization, now as many economies started imposing lockdown measures. International tourism is expected to decline all over the world for the entire year by about 58 to 78%. Now, in the Philippines, international tourist arrivals already declined by 54% from January to April 2020, and tourism revenues decreased by 55% for the same period, according to DOT Secretary Puyat. The Philippine Tourism Survey reports that 80% of tourism operators expect losses of over 50% of 2020 revenues. Using a diagram, we now lay out the input-output framework which we used to come up with our simulation results. Due to COVID-19, global demand declines, which results in lower remittances and international tourism. The decline in remittances reduces aggregate consumption and investment, while the decline in international tourism reduces exports. In turn, the decline in aggregate demand reduces the final demand for the sectoral outputs, that is, outputs of agriculture, industry, and the services sectors. Decreased demand for the outputs of these sectors, in turn, reduce the demand for the intermediate inputs used in these sectors. Now, these result in a decline in aggregate supply, which reduces the demand for factors of production, namely land, labor, capital, which in turn has adverse effects on incomes and employment in these sectors, and the overall adverse implications for growth, poverty, and inequality. So we look at the following scenarios. For remittances, we look at the effects of a 5%, 9%, and 40% decline in cash remittances. Whereas for tourism, we look at a 58% and 78% decline in inbound tourism. This is in accordance with the forecasts made by the UNWTO. Now we look at the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances. A 5% decline in remittances results in a 76 billion peso decline in gross value added, equivalent to about 0.39% of GDP. This is the same as, or almost the same as, the BSP's forecast. And a potential employment decline of around 140,000 jobs, equivalent to 0.34% of 2019 total employment. Now, a 9% decline in remittances results in a 0.70% decline in GDP. That's about 137 billion pesos. And a 0.60% decline in total employment. This is around 603,000 jobs. A 40% decline in remittances would result in a 3.13% decline in GDP, equivalent to about 610 billion pesos, and a 2.68% decline in total employment, which is equivalent to about 1.12 million jobs. This table here shows the 10 most affected subsectors from decreased remittances. The total gross value-added losses in these sectors account for about 0.30% to 2.38% of GDP. The most heavily affected sectors are wholesale and retail, which is the hardest hit by far. These are the malls, grocery stores, etc. Ownership of dwellings and real estate activities. Primarily condominiums, which according to anecdotes were funded heavily by OFW remittances. Electricity, education, accommodation and food service activities. These are mainly hotels, restaurants, resorts, land transport, food manufacturing, furniture and fixtures, and communication. Communication, we have mobile and internet usage. Moving on to the simulated output and employment effects of decreased inbound tourism, a 58% to 78% decline in inbound tourism results in a 318 to 428 billion peso decrease in gross value added, equivalent to 1.63 to 2.19% decline in GDP. The potential employment losses range from about 916,000 to 1.23 million jobs, equivalent to 2.20 to 2.96% of total employment. As in the case of decreased remittances, the services sector is and by far the most heavily affected sector. gross value added losses of the 10 most heavily affected sectors range from about 1.19% to 1.60% of GDP. Again, the most heavily affected sector is wholesale and retail, but this is followed closely by accommodation and food service activities, then by arts, entertainment and recreation, food manufacturers, air transport, non-bank financial intermediation, electricity, other mining and quarrying, land transport, and petroleum and other fuel products. The potential employment losses in these 10 sectors range from about 670,000 to 900,000 jobs. So the range is about 1.61% to 2.17% of total employment. In both cases, in the case of decreased remittances and decreased tourism, 6 to 7 out of the 10 hardest hit subsectors belong to the services sector, while the rest are industry subsectors. Now on to some policy implications. Counter the decline in demand due to decreased remittances and tourism by boosting consumer and investor confidence by first proactively dealing with the public health sector crisis. One way of concretely doing this is by fast-tracking investments on telemedicine, which can help unburden our healthcare facilities. Another is to prioritize help to micro, medium, and small enterprises or MSMEs. In all simulations, wholesale and retail, accommodation and food service activities emerged in the top 10 most heavily affected sectors, while some subsectors are under manufacturing. Now, according to the PSA's 2018 list of establishments, 46% of MSME establishments are under wholesale and retail, 14.5% in accommodation and food service activities, and 12% in manufacturing. These three alone employ about 3.61 million workers, equivalent to almost 9% of total employment. Help then can be in the form of loans and other liquidity support measures to address their cash flow problems, to preserve jobs, ensure business continuity, and build capacity for strengthening resilience to adverse shocks. Another policy implication involves preparing comprehensive, well-coordinated, and clearly communicated tourism recovery plans, beginning with domestic tourism. Recovery will have to start by encouraging domestic tourism with strictly implemented health protocols. And it has to start with domestic tourism as one. This has the lion's share of tourism expenditures, around 85%. And number two, restoring inbound tourism confidence will also depend on how well domestic tourism is handled. Last is build resilience through increased digitization and production flexibility. Building resilience involves making investments not only on physical capital, for example, roads, bridges, machinery and equipment, etc., but also on human capital, that is education and health, and on improving technology, especially information and communication technology. The current pandemic has brought to light the importance of digitization, especially in facilitating contactless transactions and social distancing. Sectors and firms that are able to more flexibly transform their operations and leapfrog faster onto digital or online platforms stand to lose less and gain more quickly during and in the aftermath of the pandemic. In this further connection, public-private investments are key to fast-tracking improvements in digital technology and infrastructure, which would potentially generate gains that will outlast the effects of this current global pandemic. This ends my presentation. Thank you, and the floor is now open for your questions. Okay, thank you. Now we open the floor to your questions.
Okay. Okay, so this is a question from Dr. Mangajas addressed to yours truly. Have you estimated the effect of the transport lockdown on the various sectors? So, not yet, sir, although we've come up with, well, I have estimates like for the entire economy, that takes into account the effects of the decline in final demand for the different subsectors. So that includes, for the transport sector. But then the simulation is for the entire economy. And I am just not at liberty yet to, to divulge.
Your model does not include the linkage from transportation to all of those things. You see, it's as though you can proceed to those sectors without taking care of the transportation needs of the workers and of the people who are going to be making use of those sectors. To me, that's the most important.
Actually,
the input-output, most important link is to have the transportation so that the workers of those sectors can go to work, and then the people who are buying the products of those services can go there and also make use of them, because this is not going to be all virtual, virtual
actually,
work.
sir, in the when we did the simulation, so we made assumptions regarding the decline in expenditure for transport services, for land, for airport, according to the shares of transport expenditures that say OFW households or households with OFWs or tourists, spend on these sectors. So those are already implicitly included in the simulation.
More basic yet, Sarah, the ability of the workers to take transportation to go to work in those sectors, and the ability of the demanders to take transportation to go to make use of those particular sectors. Ordinary jeepneys, for example. I think the jeepney transport sector is completely, out of the model, as though people are thinking it's there, but that's the most important missing link in letting, in improving the economy.
I agree, sir. Although we've just focused, as I said, in the simulations, we just focused on the effects of decline in remittances on the spending patterns of households that are receiving these remittances, and also of those sectors, the decline in the demand for the sectors that are directly involved in the tourism sectors. So those also include, a certain extent, land, air, water transport services.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I have a question for Maha. Maha, I thought I heard you that the intermittency problem of REs, these are the REs like solar and wind, not the hydro, is alleviated. Can you please explain that? Is there a new technology now that they would really have batteries or access to batteries so that they can become mainstay for our energy power?
The intermittency cost. So one solution to the intermittency cost is the battery storage, right?
Yes.
Although the development of the battery, the technological development of battery is not as fast as we all know relative to the development of solar panels. But that's not the only solution to intermittency. There are other solutions like that, diversification. Like in the US, we have the hydro to cover for the intermittency problem. And there's also the technology with regards to the projecting the demand in terms of the system being used in the wholesale electric in the systems operator. So that's also part of managing the intermittency. So all those combined, uses of managing the intermittency shows that it's already falling in the US. So the question now is, given that we are seeing those falling costs for intermittency and that the technology for battery storage is up and coming, why do we have slower investments in the Philippines for those REs?
Later.
Yes, Dr. Pernia.
Sports car.
You have a question? Yes, please, Dr. Pernia.
Yes, again, a couple of quick questions. Just to segue from Monching Clarete's question on Maha. You mentioned a conundrum. You said that despite the FIT being applied to renewables, there's still the investment in renewables is still very shy, or they're still staying away from renewables. Is it because the FIT is a signal that that the cost of renewables are going to be unstable or unpredictable, and that is what is keeping away investors in renewables? And then just a very quick question also to Sarah and Jeff. I'm sure you have seen the data comparing the expenditures or spending on COVID-19 related issues across ASEAN countries, and the Philippines is really badly lagging behind. For example, we are only spending as a percentage to GDP, we're only spending 5.7%, whereas Vietnam is spending 10% of GDP, Thailand 16%, Malaysia 22%, and Indonesia 6%. So I think it would be useful, and on per capita basis also very low. We're only spending $197 dollars per person, whereas Vietnam is spending $277 per person. In Thailand is $1,211 per person, and so on. Anyway, I think that the problem is we are not spending enough on COVID, with respect to the health aspect as well as to the economy, and therefore, perhaps by getting a ballpark figure in terms of how much it would cost, what you have recommended, what Jeff has recommended in terms of social safety net and additional spending on also employment insurance and so on. And then Sarah's recommendation, Dr. Sarah's recommendations on how to boost tourism, and especially tourism, and also the remittances. How much would that be in terms of additional spending by the government, so that at least we can, signal to the government that we should really spend more rather than less on this COVID related issues. Thank you.
May I go first?
Maha, thank you for.
Yes, thank you, Sec Ernie, for the question. Actually, what we are saying is that FIT is actually very costly. It's a subsidy, and we are the ones paying it. So in the bill that we have, it's the FIT all allowance. So that's the one that we are paying. So it's very costly. And in another paper, we have simulated the cost, the welfare cost of FIT. What we're saying is that the cost of renewables, the technology, is already declining. So it's probably, I still don't have the study to back this up, but it's likely that the bureaucratic hurdles is the one that's impeding the investments of this renewable in the Philippines. In the beginning, most countries really did use FIT. But again, there's a lot of studies in the US that have already demonstrated the welfare cost of using the subsidies. And even in ASEAN, there's a recent paper, I think by Lantau Group, that's saying that Asian countries are now moving away from these subsidies because the technology is really now, the cost of this technology is really now going down. The battery, the development of the technology for battery is also going down. So all these things about managing the cost of intermittency is also declining. So we should hopefully be seeing more of solar and wind into the grid. And recently, there's already news about solar generation being offered outside of FIT. So because it's becoming now competitive.
But isn't FIT supposed to be an incentive for investors to come in and invest in renewables?
Yes,
That's the
but it's
idea. Yeah.
But it's a very costly subsidy. So rather than subsidizing, because it's now becoming cheaper now, the technology.
Costly to the government. It's costly to the government, but beneficial.
We're the one paying for the
to the customer. Yeah.
Yeah, we're the one paying for the subsidy. In the
it's going to be it should attract investors. I thought that was the idea.
Yeah, it did, but there's a particular amount where they can be subscribed to. So now, for solar, the subscription has already been filled, and advocates are advocating for a higher subscription. But there's also supplier who already offering generation that is outside FIT, meaning they can already compete. So it's becoming now cost competitive.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ma. So any ballpark figure estimate, Jeff, in terms of what would be the cost to the government if we do all those things that you have recommended, like employment insurance and additional subsidies, social safety nets, and all that?
Okay, sir, thank you for the question. So I don't have any ballpark figure yet. We're in the process of computing them, but I'll just note that I agree with the sentiment you expressed earlier that we're probably under investing at the moment in terms of social protection. We are in extraordinary times. I think the old yardsticks as to what are acceptable in terms of deficit to GDP ratio or even debt to GDP ratio, I think we should move away from them. Of course, we should not completely abandon prudence, but I don't think we should be afraid to incur a larger deficit or a larger debt if the goal is to actually help those who are in great distress. Because what is the government for if not to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected? So I don't have any ballpark figure yet, but for sure it is much more than what was allocated for in Bayanihan 1 in terms of the social protection component of it.
Yeah, it's rather ironic because we have, I think, among the best credit rating among ASEAN countries, and yet we're not taking advantage of that. We are rather protecting it rather than being afraid of spending more, so borrowing more, and therefore risking the downgrade. So that I think that is the thing now. That I think is not the correct direction or vision on the part of the government. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sec Manager, for those questions. Well, as Jack said, we still don't have an overall estimate right now. But the official estimates for the decline in GDP for the entire year is now between -3% to -4%. And we've only, I think, spent or only about 200 billion pesos were disbursed of the 390 from the Bayanihan 1 Act. So that's definitely very, very small. If we're going to plug in the whole 3 to 4%, would need about 800 billion to about 1 trillion pesos, depending on the fiscal multiplier. Now, the fiscal multiplier, well, we don't have an exact estimate, but my sense is that during recessions, the fiscal multiplier tends to be lower, even as people hold off their spending decisions, both consumers and investors. So definitely, you're right. What's been allocated so far is, think not enough, even 1.3 trillion, because that might just plug in like a hole of about -5%, -6% growth. But with what's happening right now, my sense is that the GDP growth prospects for the entire year might even be more dire.
Thank you, Professor Sarah.
Could I just comment on this COVID? And it's more about, I think, if COVID is teaching us something, it's really shifting from in-person to online, all this physical distribution to logistics to using online commerce. So the most important part of investment that we really have to consider is making that internet infrastructure really fast, because that is, I think, holding us down in taking advantage of new ways of distributing goods. And even our traditional farming, I mean, you can develop a supply chain that is basically dependent on our using information technology, ICT. But then if they don't have access there in the farm, at the farm, in the rural areas for internet, that will really delay us. So I think if we are thinking about making more investments for recovering from COVID, or leaping into newer, better future, I think the government should really make our internet infrastructure a lot better.
Agree. That's right.
We agree. And is Dr. Balisacan still here? Because I think that has implications for probably for bringing in a third telco, even more to spur competition in the industry.
Second the motion, Mon.
Sorry, Sarah, are you asking me a question, or sorry?
Yes, because Sir Munching was talking about revamping up our internet facilities, internet connection, and I think that's pretty much connected, very well connected to the issue of having a third or even more telcos.
That's correct.
No, sir, I think we lost Dr. Balisacan. No, sir.
I think this proves the point, ma'am. Naghang po si sir.
Sayang. Okay, we'll go back to Dr. Balisacan. Just case in point, no? Like, how important good internet connections are, and if they go bust, then yeah, meetings such as this are. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Ma'am Giselle has a question po.
Yes, Sarah, I just wanted to ask you this question. I noted in your slide on OFWs that, and you highlighted it, a very small percentage that's invested, their remittances to education. And yet we know that we have to think of the long-term benefits of these remittances on our GDP and on the economy. So are there measures you could think of to divert or to increase the investment, I mean, in a strategic or targeted way, of these remitters to the education of their families and their communities? Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. I think Jeff would be in a better position to answer that.
Okay, sorry, I only heard the question very vaguely.
So,
So it's about the how to ensure that, or how to try to make remittances be more beneficial in terms of being used more for education. Well, actually, although if you actually look at the household data, what you find when you examine it is that households with OFWs controlling for income and other household characteristics, they actually spend more on education than non-OFW households. So even if they have the same income, so they are more likely, for example, to send their children to college, to a private college at that, compared to a similar non-OFW household. But as a percent of total spending, I guess it is still small. That's partly because for many OFWs and a big portion of the OFW households are in the top income groups. Like 60% of them belong to the top 40% of households. A lot of them, the bank or their money is invested in real estate. So if their money is invested in a bank, for example, or saved in a bank, even though they themselves are not investing, they are making the money available for investors to borrow. So I think, in fact, that one of the reasons why interest rates have been quite low for a time, one factor that has contributed to that is this large inflow of remittances that go into the banking system. I think we have to sort of also move away from the old model where you expect the OFWs to themselves be the entrepreneurs. Some of them can do that, but some of them cannot do that. For those who cannot do that, maybe it's enough that they save money, make sure that they earn enough in terms of return on investment, but they don't have to make the investment themselves. But make sure that the money is available for others to use in investment.
Yeah, so follow-up comment from me. So looks like if they invest in the bank, right, those investments could support MSMEs, right? But the other major we call funnel for all those remittances earned would be the condos, the real estate, and that again is something that does not have the inclusivity of the effect of inclusive growth and development. And so the savings, the remittances of the OFWs, they're just caught into the coffers of the top wealthiest in the country. So this has always been our concern, that there might be a way for the government to influence by incentives the way our OFWs invest their money.
Okay, so I agree, ma'am, that it's probably true that too much of the remittances go to the purchase of condominium units, for example. So you have a lot of condominium units that are actually not occupied, whether you're looking at condominiums in Metro Manila or Tagaytay, for example. And in fact, that's the one reason why we expect the construction and real estate to probably go down some more this year and probably next because of the decline in remittances. I think addressing that, it's I think the problem is the environment for entrepreneurship, the environment for investment. I think that's the one that government has to address. Maybe other people will have something to say on this also, like Dr. Bolongaita, for example. So people put their money into condominiums because it's difficult for them to find an alternative that is guaranteed to generate a good return, while at the same time putting not too much risk on them. And addressing that problem requires generating or establishing a good environment for entrepreneurship, which means that you must have a strong rule of law in place. The, the, the time it takes for people to establish a business should be relatively quick, and so on.
Yeah, it's what we wish it was a virtuous cycle, Sec Ernie, but it's a vicious cycle. And it boils down to, well, the need for more S&T education that would create a more or higher value among our MSMEs and, well, make our GDP growth more inclusive, if I think I get it right, because a lot of the GDP is reflective of, you know, what's growth and development of still the wealthy sector of our population. So I think that there might be ways to support STI ecosystems that would then be established in the regions of the country. And I really think that OFWs might have an important role in supporting and sustaining this. In another session of this conference, we had a model of a very successful farm, Costales Farm in Laguna, that is supported by OFWs. So that's one way of doing it. But the other way is, as I've always suggested, to try to incentivize X% of our OFWs to come home to their regions and establish MSEs, even if you say that they're not entrepreneurs, but they've learned how to do things properly in the medical sector, the health sector, the hotel or tourism sector, and other business sectors in the advanced countries where they are working. So, you know, if we had this kind of competent and skilled human capital back in their regions, there might be a way to jumpstart or to seed these higher value MSMEs in these regions.
Agree, ma'am. There's a question on the chat board. This is addressed to Jeff. How can we increase private or venture capital investment in technology and R&D? Does this involve matching funds from government?
Sorry, I had the problem unmuting myself. I think especially now, Dr. Serafika, I think especially now that will be an important aspect of increasing private capital investment. Because of course now, the animal spirits or the enthusiasm of people for consumption is very low. At the same time, the importance of investment in technology has never been more important. I think now there's a great pressure for countries, for example, to try to accelerate their moves towards Industry 4.0. But how will they do that if there is no clear returns? There are no clear returns in the near future. So I think there's an important role for government to support such investments by, for example, providing matching funds to reduce the risks for those who would want to invest in technology that will actually be productive for the country over the longer term.
Just to add to that, Jeff, I think the question brings to mind the example in Israel, no? Where, as you know, it is probably one of the most successful countries with respect to commercialization, and the startup culture there is something that has been embraced by Silicon Valley itself. No? So there, in terms of the density of startups in Israel, since they have the explanation for that, so to speak, has been in great part due to the role of government, but in its involvement in partnership with private capital. However, one of the interesting things about that is that in Israel, government investments, they've been willing to take a loss, no? and even not entering the space without really seeking to generate a profit, no? In the sense that they even were willing to take a backseat to the private investors. So to letting the private sector really be even more incentivized. So I think that explains in part, how government was able to attract, private capital. The role of the university sector, of course, as Professor Concepcion mentioned, referred to, cannot be, I think, understated. And again, you will see that in Israel's experience, and of course in the U.S. as well. There are important, elements for incentivizing, faculty and students to be entrepreneurial. And it doesn't mean that if a country is wealthy, they can have a very successful commercialization culture in universities. Australia invests a lot in research, but is at the last of the OECD rankings. We are not very good at commercializing, publicly funded research, unlike compared to in the U.S., for example. And part of this is the fact that in Australia the government's investment in research, they seek to get a big cut from inventors' products. So you've got for example, in Australia the federal government will take a third, the state a third, and then a third will go to the inventor, for commercially funded research. In Carnegie Mellon and other universities, it's the 5% rule. Universities only take 5%, and inventor is king. So there is, again, those are the, some of the small details that I think can make a big difference to spurring innovation and commercialization.
Thank you, Dr. Bolongaita. Dr. Balisacan, sir, you were cut off earlier. You were saying something about the importance of having more competition amongst our telcos.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got disconnected. That only tells you how good our internet facility is. But yeah, I was saying that there's really a major challenge for the country to roll out quickly this internet connectivity infrastructure. And the problems is really quite extensive, involving from local governments all the way to national governments, including regulators. and yet, as we address the COVID-19 challenges and the recovery issues, there are also calls to actually even weaken regulators that are supposedly like the competition authority, for example, to supposedly strengthen the capacity of the economy to make markets even work more effectively, even during and especially even during times like this, because the possibilities for mergers that could turn out to be anti-competitive are quite high during this time. And given an economy like us that is, so to begin with, already highly concentrated, these opportunities for mergers and acquisitions, which are likely to be too many, are likely going to even exacerbate that problem. So I think it's it's a leadership concern that we need to embrace, that these challenges be addressed. But let me also quickly address that or comment on the investment issue earlier, especially in relation to the OCW. I think that there, Dr. Concepcion was noting the need to provide better information, information sets to OCWs as to where they could place their money, so that it could help them directly, but also it could help the economy moving forward. I think that I am usually quite allergic to the idea that OCWs, households themselves, do not know where to put their money best. I think that what we should embrace and what we know in our understanding of household dynamics is that they're so much constrained by the information set. So they behave on the basis of the information that they have. I think Dr. Bolongaita earlier mentioned about information asymmetry. And I think that's what the problem facing our OCWs and many households. They don't have the much information about what opportunities are there are available, and also that there's this big issue about the investment climate that mentioned by Jeff. I think the big challenge really here is in this country is the improvement in the investment climate. Let me note that when we were doing that ambition natin 2040, it struck us to find when we do a nationwide survey of households that one of the single most ambitions or aspirations of Filipinos is to have a decent home and a home that's detached, and given that, and you frame that in the context of the backlogs in housing, I think that the observation that you see that OCWs, when they have the money, they use that for real estate. That's essentially what it is. That's what they want to see an improvement in their welfare, that dimension of welfare in the housing, and given the backlogs, as I said, even that. Even if they put their money in real estate, that is going to have a major impact, tremendous impact for many years on the economy. Because and you can use this real estate construction industry as a whole as one of the pillars of economic growth for many years. And so I am not too worried about about investors or OCW's resources going into real estate because of this, the nature of the backlogs and the aspirations of Filipinos. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balansacan, for that. Now, we're well over the time allotted to us. So we'd like to thank again our speakers for such very interesting and informative presentations, and also to all the participants, all those who've asked their questions. Thank you for spending time with us. Ma'am Gisela, would you like to give the final words?
Yes, I'm very grateful to our speakers, our distinguished speakers, and to our distinguished participants for staying on with us. And this is supposed to be only for 2 hours, but we're now on 3.5 hours. And it's understandable because this is probably one of the most important sessions in PAASE 40th anniversary symposium. And it concerns our national welfare. So thank you very much to all. And I'm hoping that some of you will keep on following PAASE's activities. So we have an active website. Actually, for those who are members in the audience, we have a campaign to get a Start Fresh lifetime membership fee paid, okay? Because we want to raise some funds for PAASE. We're private, non-government. We also welcome donations to our organization, and we have actually identified about 10, 11 categories of projects that we would like to support. And this would include helping our postgraduate students earn their PhDs abroad. Of course, it's lopsided in terms in favor of the United States because this is the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering with its origins in 1980 in the United States. But we're also going to support the writing of policy papers and training of, say, researchers in state universities and colleges, in leading universities in Metro Manila, and likewise the training of our postgraduate students in universities in the United States and elsewhere. So we're trying to create this STI ecosystem that we feel should be regionalized. Okay? So we'd like to showcase some regions that might show how science and technology is improving their lives. So thank you very much, everyone, for your focused attention. In particular, I'd like to thank our former NEDA secretaries who graced this occasion, Secretary Ernie Pernia and Secretary R.C. Balisacan. Also, our academician, Nas Mahar Mangahas. And of course, well, our special guest speaker, now our member in the PAASE, Dr. Emil Bolongaita, and everyone else. Former Dean Ramon Clarete, Dr. Daway-Ducanes, Dr. Majah-Leah Ravago, and Dr. Sarah Daway-Ducanes. Thank you. Good day, good night, good afternoon to all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.